Linda Hansen. She's a writer and writing as LP Hansen, an author and a storyteller for peace. And she is going to share some more of the history of peace in this country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you, Linda.
Gandhi called non-violence a force, a universal force like electricity. Non-violence is positive action, demanding the highest intelligence and courage. And many in these islands have honoured this force. Their stories are linked together on an indestructible thread. At this end is New Zealand's Christchurch call to end violence online. But for the other end, we must go back hundreds of years. Ocean currents are taking voyages from Polynesia to islands east of New Zealand they call Rēkohu, the rising sun. They are people later known as Moriori, Polynesians with their own customs and traditions. They are not Māori. As their numbers increase, tensions grow, and at last a very great leader, Nunuku Whenua, demands an end to tribal fighting. It's not easy, but the people obey, starting more than 500 years of a society free from killing. They prosper, settling their differences by wrestling and stick fighting. They honour non-violence and they wear white feathers in their hair as a sign of peace. 500 years later, two warring Māori tribes from Taranaki invade to seize the islands. The Moriori offer to share. It's their way. A handful of former sealers and whalers already farm beside them. But the invaders walk the land, killing and taking as slaves those they find. Now the Moriori have hunting weapons and numbers to drive these strangers out. But so dedicated are they to the principle of Nunuku Whenua, to the voice of life speaking through them, they will not use the weapons against people. They all agree. So Moriori are killed, they are eaten or taken as slaves, and even though slavery is already illegal on the mainland, Governor Grey and other Europeans watch the genocide and do nothing. It is a dark time, but in faraway Taranaki is a 5-year-old boy already able to hear the voice of life. Was there ever a time that Te Whiti o Rongomai did not know the peaceful wisdom of Nunuku Whenua? By the time Moriori slaves are freed 30 years later, Te Whiti with his friend Tohu are helping to build the peaceful settlement of Parihaka, and he is calling Māori back from Rēkohu to help. Parihaka becomes the centre of a non-violent campaign to resist European settlement on land confiscated from Māori. In Parihaka, men who have killed are now living peacefully. They're even wearing white feathers in their hair. The government surveys the land, they plough up the survey pegs. They're given a 14-day deadline to move into reserves, they stay. 1,600 troops with guns march on Parihaka, led by Government Minister John Bryce. Several thousand Māori sit quietly on the marae, singing children offer fresh-baked bread to the travellers. Bryce orders the invasion, the arrest of Parihaka's leaders, the village destroyed and its inhabitants dispersed. Yes, there were many horrors on that day, but there are no accounts of any deaths on either side. The fruits of violence have shed more seeds. Te Whiti and Tohu are held without trial for 16 months, yet Parihaka is rebuilt. The pair live on into their 70s, able to pass on their wisdom. In India, Gandhi hears of Te Whiti and is recorded as keeping a photograph of him on his desk. You have just heard the most wonderful account of Te Puia. His grandfather was friend to Te Whiti. Waikato Māori are amongst many thousand of other New Zealanders offering non-violent resistance to conscription into World Wars I and II. Ronald Briggs and Archie Baxter are two conscientious objectors. They influenced world opinion when they spoke about how they were kidnapped, taken to the battlefronts in Europe and tortured. But like others in this story, they would not resort to violence. They could not. Archie Barrington and many others offered similar resistance in World War II, a war it brought to a horrific end by the use of atomic weapons. The United Nations' first resolution in 1946 was for the elimination of atomic weapons. Slowly, slowly, we moved towards it. New Zealanders are filling many key roles. In the 50s, Elsie Locke and Mary Woodward helped found the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament that became the foundation for Greenpeace. A few years later, that group presented to New Zealand's Parliament its second largest petition ever, calling for the Southern Hemisphere nuclear-free zone. Labour Prime Minister Norman Kirk sends a frigate right into the testing zone to protest against France's nuclear tests. A few years later, another Labour Prime Minister, David Lange, successfully argues that the morally indefensible state of nuclear weapons. It's the same year that the French bomb the Rainbow Warrior, the flagship of Greenpeace, and murder a crewman. A couple of years later, New Zealand becomes officially nuclear-free, still the only country in the world to be so by law. In 1997, the United Nations has a model nuclear weapons convention circulated, and one of its two creators is New Zealand's Alan Ware. Alan receives the prestigious Right Livelihood Award for his ongoing work to rid the world of nuclear weapons. New Zealand's Otago University founds its National Centre for Peace and Conflict Study. The next year, Thomas Nash, another New Zealander, is key to achieving the international ban on cluster bombs. 2017, Thomas Nash is at the forefront again of the coalition that brings about the first ever prohibition of nuclear weapons ban treaty, a United Nations event in New York that brings that group the Nobel Peace Prize. In May 2019 comes Labour Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern with her Christchurch call to get rid of terrorist and extremist content online. As you know, it's signed by a large group of tech companies and 17 governments and is ongoing. That's in my 5 minutes. I've galloped through 700 years of peacemaking in a very young country, but it's a lightning tour that I hope you've enjoyed, and thank you for listening.
I'm going to ask our former Minister of Disarmament and Arms Control, Matt Robson, to talk to us from Auckland. Welcome, Matt.
Ka tangi te tite, ka tangi te kāka, ka tangi hoki aho, e ti hei Māori ora. Those are the voices of birds of New Zealand and bringing you the breath of life. It's an important day for us in New Zealand, in fact, an important number of days. We have a new public holiday called Matariki, which is the site of looking to the heavens for the new year, celebrated by Māori for centuries. It's a time of joining with nature to recognize its power, and human beings working in harmony for the new season, clearing for planting, looking forward to the spring. Remember, we are in the Southern Hemisphere, and the coming summer. It's a call for peace as well, and it's recognition of the Indigenous people of New Zealand and the long road that we still have to go to having justice. Because that brings us to the fact that New Zealand was a white settler colony from Europe, part of the British Empire. And it was founded, unfortunately, on war and dispossession. And that extended later into the Pacific, when New Zealand was the proxy power for the British Empire in seizing territories and visiting violence upon the peoples of the Pacific. That was being part of the British Empire meant we were part of war across the world. And if you travel through Europe, you'll see the thousands of young New Zealanders who lie under the soil with workers and people of many other countries. So that's part of our tradition, but there is a side of resistance and movements to peace, which is very much part of what we are. There's been moving stories about the role of Te Puia a Māori leader, woman leader of the Waikato, leading resistance, and also recognition of the dispossession of Māori people in the First World War. That opposition to the First World War and to the imperialism of that war was taken up by the founding Labour Party in 1916, and many of the leaders of the Labour Party went to jail in opposition to the war and also in support of the people of Ireland for their independence from the British Empire. But in 1914, a Labour Prime Minister set the tone that where Britain goes, we go in the Second World War. And that was really to show you that New Zealand had this tradition of being an integral part of war making. After the Second World War, we shifted alliance and allegiances to the United States. And our history led us into the war in Korea, into the war against the people of Indochina and the war crimes committed there, and in testing in the Pacific for the colonial powers. But a resistance grew up, and the war against the peoples of Indochina and the war crime that it was became something that the New Zealand people rebelled against. It was a pivotal time for the change in New Zealand's population, grasping the idea that we must be a country with an independent foreign policy to break free of what Bob Dylan called the masters of war. And that was successful. Opposition to testing in the Pacific after the Vietnam War grew strongly. That was led by Māori, who had a recognition that their family in the Pacific were the victims of testing. And out of that grew a powerful anti-nuclear movement. By succeeding with the anti-nuclear movement and with legislation in 1987 to make New Zealand nuclear free, both in terms of arms and power, and also to then help to forge the nuclear free status of the South Pacific in a treaty across the whole of the Pacific, New Zealand became known to the whole world as a country in the forefront of peace. And this was the work of the people of New Zealand. And it was a contribution to peace for the people of New Zealand. And I, as Minister of Disarmament and Arms Control in the government led by Prime Minister Helen Clark and Deputy Prime Minister Jim Anderton, was authorized to go to the world and say that New Zealand was going to help to free the world of nuclear weapons. And that meant that we would stay out of the military blocs that we had been evicted from, and this was one of them, by becoming nuclear free. I was able to tell the governments of NATO that we would not join with them as a nuclear armed bloc, and one that was aggressive throughout the world with over 1,000 bases spread around the world. We saw that as backward and as not contributing to peace. I'm sorry to say that we have gone backwards a little bit with this, and we're not in the forefront at the moment in terms of the fight for peace throughout the world at the government level. Our present Minister of Disarmament, a friend and colleague of mine, Phil Twyford, has been sent to the Treaty Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Review Conference in Vienna. He's a minister outside of cabinet, and he's promoting the treaty and doing a very good job to do it. At the same time, our Prime Minister is heading to Madrid to tell NATO that we are joining up to their plans for war in Europe and their plans for war against China and North Korea in the Pacific, and that we are taking part as a global partner of nuclear-armed NATO. It's a step back for New Zealand. But we are hopeful in New Zealand that the strength of the people will reach back to that tradition of tapuia, back to the first leader of the Labour Party, Harry Holland, an immigrant from Australia who came to New Zealand for 14 years, led a battle against imperialist policies in New Zealand, in the Pacific, and in the world to try and set that course for the Labour Party. We want to recover that. We want to be able to make sure that the voice of New Zealand is one that is the voice that I was authorized to have under Prime Minister Helen Clark and Deputy Prime Minister Jim Anderton. And that is that New Zealand will be in the forefront of all the nations of the world, fighting for a nuclear-free world, a world free of war, and a world that looks to give justice to all people. I thank those who brought this together today. I know how difficult it can be, particularly when things go wrong with the technology. But our audience is one that's forgiving on that basis and knows the efforts of those who put this together. So my greetings to you all. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Clare Woodham and her friends. Clare is a former South Pacific anti-nuclear activist and Pramazon, and has actively taken refuge in the teachings of Buddha. And she leads Tara dancing, meditations and study sessions on internal disarmament. And so we're going to the beautiful Buddha Centre in Napier, and over to you, Clare. Thank you.
So I'm here today with my friends, Christina Whaitiri Roberts and Charmaine. And we're just filled up, sometimes a bit mucky, about the treasures that have been shared today, the love that's all part of this movement. And we're really happy to support this peace initiative. So yeah, in the 80s, I was part of the anti-nuclear movement in Auckland, and part of organising weekly peace band sessions out supermarkets to get the national government out and the Labour government in, and just educating people about what was happening in the world nuclear-wise. And you know, from there we were really inspired by the Green and Common action to create our own Devonport Peace Camp. That was a forum for people to come together and discuss what it meant to be part of a world in which nuclear proliferation was happening, and the weapons were bristling against each other. And then that culminated in a 20,000 strong women's peace march up Queen Street. This is in 1982. Yeah, and so through that process, we really, as a small group of talkers and thinkers and musicians and actors, became very aware of the colonization that we were inheriting as white privileged Pākehā in Aotearoa, and also aware of the ongoing colonization that was happening in our own land, as well as what was happening in the Pacific in terms of the French testing their bombs in Mururoa, British having tested in the Marshall Islands, etc., etc. So earlier this week, we were very happy to go and see the Mothers of the Revolution, that film that started and showed the power for me of women coming together, of sharing their despair, and of that despair turning into information and empowering each other. And in a way, that's kind of what's happened for my life, coming face to face with the nuclear problem, doing what I could with my friends against it, being successful in bringing Longi government into power and all the changes that he brought about, and then facing our own role as colonizers, and then, okay, what do we do about this? So in that process, a lot of us got burnt out and blew up with each other, and our friends, older friends around, said, you've got to take care of yourselves. You really got to take care of yourself when you're a warrior. And it was shortly after that that I started my training in herbal medicine, and then again with that finding meditation practices that really help to create inner peace and to let go of all the raru, all the feelings that were constantly there and easily triggered. So here I am 40 years later in this Buddhist Centre, where we every week we do dance meditations that are about bringing in power and wisdom and compassion to our lives, so that we can be actively engaged without coming from a base of emotions that cause more unrest, that cause more division, so that we can be more careful about what we say and how we speak it and how we hold our silence. So these Buddhist practices, I love to dance and to move, and this particular type of Buddhist practice is open to anyone to come in and to connect with the power of being creative, of using our whole body, all the elements within our body, the earth, fire, water, and air within our bodies, to bring about change in our lives and in the lives of others.
I'd like to welcome Matt O'Brien, the National Coordinator of Aotearoa for Assange. and who they are committed, along with many people in the world, to freeing Julian Assange and protect our vital right to know the truth about war crimes and illegal invasions. And we're running out of time, Matt, so welcome, and a few words from you would be wonderful. Thank you.
Kia ora all, and thank you, Liz, and thank you, WorldBeyondWar, for this opportunity to speak to you about our campaign for Julian. Why Julian Assange? What has he got to do with peace? So, you know, we've heard many different wonderful approaches today to peace. They're all vital, and they all contribute. And, you know, from Parihaka non-violence, which inspired Gandhi, to the nuclear-free movement here in New Zealand in the 60s. And these are all vital, and non-violent communication, which is something I'm committed to as well. So thank you all for these wonderful sharings. And but I'd just like you to consider one vital question. You know, with all these things that we can achieve peace, there's one crucial element that we have to have peace, and that is the truth. Julian Assange famously said that in studying the wars of the last 50 years, the thing that he found was that they were all started with some kind of lie to the public in order to get public support for wars that they otherwise wouldn't agree to. The most, you know, a recent example would be the Iraq War, of course, where they professed to have evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, when in fact the United Nations weapon inspector said they did not find any such evidence. And the result is the deaths of millions of innocent people. And it's hard to hold space for that, but that is a fact. And Julian decided to do something about that. He said that if wars can be started with lies, peace can be started with truth. And it is vital that we maintain our right to know the truth. And our right to know the truth currently sits with Julian Assange in Belmarsh Prison in London, maximum security prison. He's literally charged with the crime of publishing evidence of war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and torture at Guantanamo Bay. That is literally what he is facing charges for doing. Every major human rights organization and press freedom organization in the world, including Amnesty International, Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner, and Reporters Without Borders and the United Nations Special Rapporteurs have all said that this is a major threat to global press freedom and our right to know the truth about war crimes. So that's why we're campaigning Free Julian. That's why I call on all of you to find out about this case. Go and see the movie Ithaca, which is winning awards in Australia. It's just been premiering, and it's showing today in Auckland. So we're going to head down to the Civic today and see that. And Julian Assange's father will be zooming in for a Q&A with the audience to get behind this case and tell your MPs to stand for Julian Assange. And that's what I believe New Zealand can do next, is to stand with Australia and call for Julian Assange to be brought home to protect our right to know the truth and in order to have peace.